They told her she was too soft for crisis management, too naive for real-world operations, too weak to handle what was coming. The security team laughed when she volunteered to coordinate the evacuation route. The military liaison rolled her eyes when Sarah suggested an alternative escape plan. The senior diplomat actually chuckled when she offered to lead the convoy through the mountains. But 72 hours later, when enemy forces had surrounded the compound and all official rescue attempts had failed, 100 terrified civilians followed a quiet logistics coordinator into the frozen wilderness of Balkovia. She carried no weapon, wore no armor, held no official rank. Yet she guided them through 200 miles of hostile territory, past enemy patrols, across frozen rivers, and over treacherous mountain passes without losing a single person. When they finally reached safety, the same people who had dismissed her asked a simple question: who exactly was Sarah Chen? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The emergency sirens had been wailing for 6 hours when Sarah Chen walked into the Meridian International Compound's operations center. The fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows across worried faces bent over laptops and radio equipment. Maps of Balkovia covered every wall, marked with red zones that seemed to expand with each update. The air smelled of cold coffee and fear-induced sweat. Outside the reinforced windows, smoke columns rose from 3 directions as the civil war that had been simmering for months finally boiled over into the capital city of Krevensk. Sarah moved quietly through the chaos, her worn hiking boots making soft sounds against the polished concrete floor. She wore the same clothes she always did: dark jeans, a simple gray sweater, and a faded canvas jacket that had seen better years. Her black hair was pulled back in a practical ponytail, and her only jewelry was a small silver watch that belonged to her grandmother. Everything about her appearance suggested someone who preferred to blend into the background rather than command. Attention! The Emergency Operations Center was filled with people who looked like they belonged in crisis situations. Men in tactical vests speaking into encrypted radios, women in sharp business suits coordinating with headquarters, military personnel, whose mere presence radiated authority and competence. Sarah carried a yellow legal pad and a pencil worn down to half its original length, while others hunched over tablet computers and expensive communication devices. She made notes by hand in precise, small handwriting. She had been working logistics for Meridian International for 18 months, handling supply deliveries, scheduling, maintenance, and coordinating the mundane details that kept the compound running smoothly. Most people knew her as the woman who ensured the cafeteria stayed stocked and the generators received regular service. She was efficient, reliable, and forgettable. The kind of person who made sure things worked without drawing attention to the process. The compound housed 47 international aid workers, 23 diplomatic staff, 18 private security contractors, and 12 support personnel. Each group maintained its own hierarchy, its own sense of importance, its own assumptions about who possessed the skills necessary to navigate a rapidly deteriorating situation. The security team, led by Marcus Webb, dominated most conversations with their tactical knowledge and military experience. The diplomatic staff, headed by Dr. Richard Hayes, controlled official communications and government liaisons. The aid workers deferred to those with crisis management experience, while the support staff waited for instructions from anyone who seemed to know what they were doing. Sarah had spent the morning updating supply inventories when the first explosions shook the compound walls. She methodically finished her count of medical supplies, noted the fuel levels for the backup generators, and calculated food provisions for various scenarios before joining the emergency assembly in the operations center. Her legal pad contained detailed lists written in 3 columns: essential items, personnel capabilities, and logistical considerations. While others debated evacuation strategies and argued about risk assessments, she had quietly prepared the information that would matter most if they actually needed to move 100 people quickly and safely. Marcus Webb stood at the center of the room, like a man accustomed to being the most important person wherever he went. His tactical vest displayed an array of equipment that looked both expensive and intimidating. His radio crackled constantly, with updates from his security team positioned around the compound perimeter. His voice carried the confident tone of someone who had handled dangerous situations before and expected others to follow his lead without question. He spoke in military acronyms and tactical terminology that made civilian staff nod along uncertainly, afraid to admit they didn't understand half of what he was saying. Dr. Richard Hayes commanded attention through different means. His gray hair was perfectly styled despite the crisis. His suit remained crisp despite hours of meetings, and his voice maintained the measured cadence of someone accustomed to international negotiations and high-stakes diplomacy. He spoke on secure phone lines with government officials, embassy personnel, and headquarters executives. His conversations were filled with political considerations, official protocols, and bureaucratic procedures that seemed increasingly irrelevant as explosions grew closer to the compound walls. Colonel Janet Pierce represented the military liaison office with the bearing of someone who had spent decades in uniform. Her combat boots were polished, her uniform was immaculate, and her opinions were delivered with the certainty of someone who believed that proper planning and military discipline could solve any problem. She consulted thick manuals, referenced official procedures, and coordinated with forces that might or might not be available to assist with evacuation operations. Sarah listened to their discussions from the edge of the room, making notes and observing the dynamics that were quickly establishing themselves. Marcus Webb advocated for holding their position until official rescue arrived. He believed the compound's defenses were sufficient to withstand assault until government forces could establish a security corridor. Dr. Hayes supported a diplomatic solution, convinced that negotiations with faction leaders could guarantee safe passage for international personnel. Colonel Pierce favored a coordinated military extraction using established procedures and official channels. Each approach had merit, Sarah acknowledged silently, but each also depended on factors beyond their immediate control. Official rescue required government forces that might be engaged elsewhere. Diplomatic negotiations required faction leaders who might be more interested in territorial gains and international goodwill. Military extraction required coordination with units that might not be available or able to reach their location in time. The radio reports painted an increasingly grim picture of roads blocked by fighting, airports under attack, and communication lines being systematically severed by advancing forces. Sarah made additional notes while the debate continued. Her pencil moved across the yellow pages in quick, precise strokes. She calculated walking speeds for mixed groups, estimated supply requirements for extended movement, and sketched rough terrain features from memory. Her grandmother's watch ticked quietly against her wrist, marking time that seemed to be running out faster than anyone wanted to acknowledge. The explosions outside were definitely getting closer. When the first mortar round hit the compound's outer wall, the operations center fell silent for exactly 3 seconds. Then everyone started talking at once. Marcus Webb barked orders into his radio, demanding status reports from his perimeter. Teams. Dr. Hayes began making urgent phone calls to embassy personnel and government contacts. Colonel Pierce opened her emergency protocols manual and started reading procedures aloud to anyone who would listen. The aid workers clustered together, their faces pale with the realization that their humanitarian mission had suddenly become a survival situation. Sarah stood quietly in the corner, watching the panic begin to spread through the room like water seeping through cracks in a foundation. She had seen this before, though none of her colleagues knew that. She understood how quickly organized People could become disorganized when their carefully laid plans encountered the chaos of actual crisis. She recognized the signs of institutional paralysis that occurred when multiple leaders with different priorities tried to coordinate under extreme pressure. The second mortar round hit closer, rattling the windows and causing several people to duck instinctively. The lights flickered, and for a moment, the room was illuminated only by the glow of laptop screens and the red emergency lighting that kicked in automatically. When the main power returned, Sarah noticed that several people were looking around with the unfocused expressions of individuals who were beginning to realize that their normal sources of authority and protection might not be sufficient for what was coming. Marcus Webb's radio chattered with increasingly urgent reports. His perimeter teams were taking fire from multiple directions. Government forces were retreating through the city rather than advancing to provide security. The airport had been captured by rebel forces, eliminating any possibility of air evacuation. The main roads leading out of the capital were controlled by different factions, none of whom were particularly friendly to international personnel. Dr. Hayes ended his phone calls with the slow, deliberate movements of someone who had just received very bad news. The embassy had been evacuated earlier that morning. Government officials were no longer taking calls. International rescue coordination had been suspended until the situation stabilized, which might take days or weeks. The diplomatic solutions he had been negotiating were no longer options, because the people he needed to negotiate with were either gone or unreachable. Colonel Pierce closed her procedures manual and set it aside with obvious frustration. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The military units she had been coordinating with were engaged in combat operations and could not provide extraction support. The secure corridors that featured prominently in official evacuation plans had been overrun by fighting. The carefully organized protocols that looked so comprehensive on paper were designed for situations where military control could be maintained, not for the fluid chaos of urban combat between multiple factions. Sarah finished her notes and looked up to find the operations center filled with 100 people who were beginning to understand that they might be on their own. The confident voices that had dominated earlier discussions were now speaking in hushed, uncertain tones. Maps that had been marked with evacuation routes were being erased and redrawn as reports eliminated each option in turn. The secure compound that had felt like protection a few hours earlier was beginning to feel like a trap. When the third mortar round hit the main building, Sarah Chen closed her legal pad and walked toward the center of the room. Her hiking boots moved across the concrete with the same quiet confidence she had shown all morning. Her gray sweater and faded jacket looked completely out of place among the tactical gear and business suits that surrounded her. But her dark eyes held a calmness that began to draw attention from people who were looking for anyone who seemed to know what they were doing. Marcus Webb was arguing with his team leaders about defensive positions when Sarah approached his table. Dr. Hayes was trying to reach government contacts who were no longer answering their phones. Colonel Pierce was reading new procedures that didn't seem to apply to their current situation. The operations center buzzed with the kind of frantic activity that accomplishes very little while consuming enormous amounts of energy and time. Sarah waited for a brief lull in the conversations before speaking. Her voice was quiet but clear, pitched just loud enough to be heard by the people immediately around her without demanding attention from the entire room. She didn't raise her hand or clear her throat or make any gesture that would suggest she was about to make an announcement. She simply began speaking with the same calm tone she used when discussing supply schedules or maintenance requirements. "The mountain pass through Thornfield is still open," she said, looking directly at Marcus Webb. "It's not on any of the official evacuation routes, but it leads to the Volga River Valley. From there, we can reach Sanctuary Base in approximately 60 hours if we maintain a steady pace and avoid the main roads. Marcus Webb looked up from his radio with the expression of someone who wasn't sure he had heard correctly. Dr. Hayes paused in his phone conversation to glance in Sarah's direction. Colonel Pierce lowered her procedures manual and turned toward the quiet logistics coordinator who had just offered tactical information that wasn't in any of their official briefings. Sarah continued in the same even tone, consulting her legal pad as if she were reading from a routine report. The terrain is challenging, but it's defensible if we maintain proper spacing and movement discipline. Weather conditions are marginal but manageable if we have adequate cold weather gear and shelter materials. Food and water requirements can be met through careful rationing and natural sources along the route. Marcus Webb set down his radio and stared at Sarah with the focused attention of someone trying to solve an unexpected puzzle. "How do you know about mountain passes that aren't on our tactical maps?" he asked, his voice carrying a mixture of curiosity and skepticism. Sarah looked at him with the same calm expression she wore during routine staff meetings. "I coordinate logistics for this compound," she said simply. "Understanding the local terrain and supply routes is part of my job." Dr. Hayes ended his phone call and joined the conversation with the diplomatic tone he used for formal negotiations. "Sarah, I appreciate your initiative, but evacuating 100 civilians through hostile territory requires expertise in crisis management and security operations. This isn't a matter of logistics coordination." Colonel Pierce closed her procedures manual entirely and stood up with the bearing of someone who was about to deliver an official assessment. Unauthorized evacuation attempts through unmapped terrain could endanger everyone in this compound. We need to follow established protocols and work through proper channels. Sarah nodded politely, the way she always did when people explained why her suggestions wouldn't work or why her contributions weren't needed. She had heard similar responses throughout her career at Meridian International. Her ideas were too simple, too basic, too civilian for people who handled important matters. Her perspective was too limited, too inexperienced, too narrow for situations that required real expertise. But this time, instead of returning quietly to her corner of the operations center, Sarah opened her legal pad and began reading from her notes in the same measured tone she used for inventory reports. Current compound defenses can hold for approximately 12 hours based on ammunition supplies and perimeter positions. Government rescue forces are engaged in combat operations and cannot provide extraction support within that time frame. Diplomatic negotiations require faction leaders who are currently unreachable or uninterested in protecting international personnel. She turned a page and continued reading. Available evacuation routes include the main highway system, which is controlled by hostile forces, the airport approach roads, which are under active combat, and the river valley passages, which require equipment we don't have. The mountain pass option provides concealed movement through terrain that factions are less likely to control, but it requires physical conditioning and survival skills that most compound personnel don't possess. Marcus Webb was no longer looking at Sarah with skepticism. His expression had shifted to the focused attention of someone who was hearing information that might be important. Dr. Hayes had stopped trying to make phone calls and was listening with the concentration he usually reserved for international negotiations. Colonel Pierce was taking notes, writing down details that weren't in any of her official manuals. Sarah closed her legal pad and looked around the operations center at 100 people, who were beginning to realize that their comfortable assumptions about rescue and protection might not apply to their current situation. The emergency lighting cast red shadows across worried faces. The radio chatter had become increasingly urgent as perimeter teams reported enemy forces moving closer to the compound walls. Outside the reinforced windows, the explosions were definitely getting louder. "The mountain pass option isn't easy," Sarah continued in the same quiet voice. "It requires everyone to carry their own supplies, maintain movement discipline, and follow instructions without debate or discussion. It means leaving behind everything except essential survival gear. It means trusting one person to make decisions for the entire group, even when those decisions might seem wrong or dangerous. She paused and looked directly at Marcus Webb, then at Dr. Hayes, then at Colonel Pierce. Her expression remained calm and professional, but something in her dark eyes suggested depths that none of them had noticed during 18 months of routine interactions. It also means acknowledging that survival situations don't always respect official rank or institutional authority. She said quietly, "Sometimes the person who knows how to get everyone out alive isn't the person who looks like a leader or sounds like an expert or wears the right uniform." The operations center fell silent except for the crackling of radios and the distant sound of explosions. 100 people stood in a secure compound that was beginning to feel less secure with each passing hour. Maps covered the walls, marked with evacuation routes that were no longer viable. Communication equipment connected them to officials who could no longer help. Emergency procedures provided protocols for situations that no longer matched their reality. And in the center of it all, a quiet logistics coordinator with worn hiking boots and a yellow legal pad had just offered to lead them through 200 miles of enemy territory to safety. The same woman they had dismissed as too soft, too inexperienced, too civilian for crisis management, was now the only person in the room who seemed to have a plan that might actually work. Sarah Chen closed her legal pad, tucked her pencil behind her ear, and waited for their answer while her grandmother's silver watch ticked quietly against her wrist and the world outside continued to fall apart around them. Marcus Webb crossed his arms and leaned back in his chair with the expression of someone who had just heard a child offer to drive the family car. His tactical vest creaked slightly as he shifted position, and the radio clipped to his shoulder continued its steady stream of urgent updates from his security teams. The operations center's harsh lighting reflected off his equipment, creating the kind of visual authority that had served him well throughout his military career and private security work. He looked at Sarah Chen the way a professional looks at an amateur who doesn't understand the scope of their own ignorance. "Sarah," he said, using the tone reserved for explaining obvious facts to well-meaning civilians, "I appreciate that you know the local area from your logistics work, but coordinating supply deliveries is very different from moving 100 people through active combat zones." He gestured toward the tactical maps spread across the table, each one marked with symbols and annotations that represented months of professional security assessment. Mountain warfare requires specialized training, advanced equipment, and tactical experience that takes years to develop. We're not talking about hiking trails here. Dr. Hayes nodded in agreement, his diplomatic instincts aligning with the security assessment, despite their frequent disagreements on other matters. His phone had finally stopped ringing with calls from officials who could no longer help, leaving him with the uncomfortable realization that formal channels were no longer available. Still, his years of international crisis management told him that leadership during emergencies required specific qualifications and institutional backing that a logistics coordinator simply didn't possess. "Marcus raises valid concerns," Dr. Hayes said, his voice carrying the measured authority of someone accustomed to managing complex international situations. "Evacuation operations involve legal considerations, diplomatic protocols, and risk assessments that require coordination with multiple agencies. We can't simply walk into the wilderness and hope for the best. There are proper procedures for these situations, even when circumstances are challenging." Colonel Pierce stepped forward with the bearing of someone who had spent decades ensuring that proper procedures were followed regardless of circumstances. Her uniform remained crisp despite hours of crisis management, and her posture conveyed the kind of institutional confidence that had guided military operations through countless difficult situations. She carried a thick binder filled with emergency protocols that covered dozens of scenarios, each one carefully developed by experts who understood the complexities of large-scale evacuations. The compound's defensive capabilities are designed to provide security until official rescue operations can be coordinated, she said, consulting her documentation with the precision of someone who trusted systems over improvisation. Abandoning established defensive positions to attempt unauthorized movement through unmapped terrain violates basic tactical principles. We have communication equipment, defensive positions, and supply reserves that give us significant advantages over trying to move through hostile territory. Sarah listened to their objections with the same patient attention she gave to vendors who explained why supply deliveries would be delayed or contractors who detailed why maintenance schedules needed to be adjusted. She had heard similar explanations throughout her career at Meridian International, always delivered with the assumption that her perspective was too limited to understand the complexities that real professionals handled. Her role was to coordinate the mundane details while others made the important decisions that required actual expertise. Elena Volkov, the regional security advisor, joined the conversation with the confidence of someone whose knowledge of local conditions was considered essential for any serious planning. She had spent 3 years in Balkovia, building relationships with government officials and faction leaders that provided Meridian International with the kind of insider information that kept operations running smoothly. Her expertise in regional politics and cultural dynamics made her opinion particularly valuable when assessing risks and opportunities. The mountain regions are controlled by irregular forces who don't distinguish between humanitarian workers and military targets, Elena said, her accent carrying traces of the Eastern European languages she spoke fluently. These aren't organized armies following international conventions. They're local militias, criminal groups, and displaced fighters who see international personnel as valuable hostages or symbols of foreign interference. Moving through their territory without proper escort or diplomatic protection would be extremely dangerous. David Torres, the communications specialist, looked up from his bank of radio equipment with the expression of someone who had been monitoring increasingly disturbing reports all morning. His equipment provided real-time intelligence about conditions throughout the region, painting a picture that grew darker with each update. The sophisticated communication networks that usually kept the compound connected to the outside world were being systematically disrupted by fighting that showed no signs of stopping. The radio chatter indicates at least 6 different factions operating in the mountain areas, he said, his voice tight with concern. They're using the terrain to avoid government forces, which means they're definitely active in exactly the areas where any overland evacuation would need to travel. Plus, the Weather Service is predicting heavy snow within the next 48 hours. Mountain conditions in winter are dangerous even for experienced climbers with proper equipment. Sarah absorbed their concerns without argument or defensiveness, making additional notes in her legal pad with the methodical attention she brought to all her work. Each objection represented real challenges that would need to be addressed if they decided to leave the compound's relative security. She wasn't dismissing their expertise or minimizing the risks they identified, but she was also calculating factors that their professional focus might be overlooking. Marcus Webb continued his assessment with the systematic thoroughness of someone who had planned security operations in multiple conflict zones. His experience included situations where split-second decisions determined whether missions succeeded or failed, and his instincts told him that complex problems required professional solutions implemented by people with appropriate training and equipment. Even if we could navigate the terrain safely, he said, pointing to elevation markers on the topographical maps, we're talking about moving 100 people who have no experience with tactical movement, no training in fieldcraft, and no equipment designed for extended operations in hostile territory. Aid workers, diplomats, administrative staff, maintenance personnel. These aren't soldiers or survival experts. They're civilians who've never been in a situation where their lives depend on following orders without question. Dr. Hayes leaned forward with the expression of someone who was about to make a point that he considered particularly important. His diplomatic experience had taught him to identify potential problems before they became actual crises, and he could see numerous ways that an unauthorized evacuation attempt could create international incidents that would complicate rescue efforts for years to come. There are also legal and political considerations, he said, his voice carrying the weight of someone who understood how international crises could escalate beyond their immediate circumstances. If we abandon the compound without authorization from our respective governments, we could be accused of deserting our posts or failing to protect classified materials and sensitive information. The diplomatic repercussions could affect international aid operations throughout the region. Colonel Pierce opened her procedures manual to a section marked with bright yellow tabs, indicating emergency protocols that she had reviewed countless times during her career. The military's approach to crisis management emphasized careful planning, proper authority, and systematic implementation of tested procedures. Improvised solutions, no matter how well-intentioned, created risks that could compound rapidly in complex situations. Standard evacuation procedures require advanced reconnaissance, secure communications with extraction points, and coordination with military units that can provide support if evacuation routes are compromised. She read from the manual, her voice carrying the authority of institutional knowledge. Attempting movement without these safeguards violates basic security principles and puts personnel at unnecessary risk. The proper response is to maintain defensive positions while working through official channels to coordinate rescue operations. Sarah continued taking notes while the professionals around her explained why her suggestion was impractical, dangerous, and inappropriate for people without proper training and authority. Their objections were logical and well-reasoned, based on years of experience in their respective fields. They understood aspects of crisis management that she had never studied formally. Their institutional knowledge represented accumulated wisdom from countless operations that had succeeded or failed based on adherence to proven principles. Yet as she listened to their explanations, Sarah found herself calculating factors that their expertise might not be considering. The compound's defensive capabilities that Colonel Pierce described depended on ammunition supplies that were finite and couldn't be resupplied. The communication equipment that David Torres monitored was only useful if there were officials available to coordinate with, and those officials were increasingly unreachable. The diplomatic channels that Dr. Hayes preferred required negotiating partners who might be more interested in territory than in protecting international personnel. Elena Volkov had accurate information about faction activities in the mountain regions, but her intelligence was based on normal patterns of movement and control that might not apply during active combat operations. Marcus Webb's security assessments were professionally sound, but they assumed that the compound's defenses could hold long enough for external rescue to arrive, and the radio reports suggested that external rescue was becoming less likely with each passing hour. The fourth mortar round hit close enough to rattle the entire building, causing several people to duck reflexively and sending a cascade of dust from the ceiling tiles. The lights flickered again, and this time the emergency power took several seconds longer to engage. When the main lighting returned, Sarah noticed that the confident expressions around the operations center had become slightly more strained. The secure compound that had felt like protection was beginning to feel like a target. Marcus Webb's radio crackled with a report that made him frown and reach for his headset. One of his perimeter teams was reporting movement in the industrial area beyond the compound's eastern wall. Government forces were withdrawing through that sector, which meant that hostile forces would likely occupy those positions within hours. The compound's defensive perimeter was designed to repel small-scale attacks, not sustained assault by organized forces with military equipment. Dr. Hayes ended another unsuccessful phone call and set down his satellite phone with obvious frustration. The embassy personnel he had been trying to reach were no longer responding to communications. Government offices were either evacuated or no longer functioning. International organizations that might coordinate rescue operations were dealing with their own security crises throughout the region. The diplomatic solutions that looked viable a few hours earlier were evaporating as the situation deteriorated. Colonel Pierce received an update through her military communication channels that caused her to close her procedures manual and reach for additional documentation. The military units that might provide extraction support were engaged in combat, operations that would continue for an indefinite period. Secure corridors that featured in official evacuation plans were no longer secure. The carefully organized protocols that looked comprehensive on paper assumed a level of military control that no longer existed in their area. Sarah looked around the operations center at 100 people who were beginning to understand that their assumptions about rescue and protection might not match their current reality. The institutional authority that usually provided guidance and security was failing to generate solutions that could be implemented within their time constraints. Professional expertise that had handled previous crises was encountering a situation that didn't respond to standard approaches. David Torres looked up from his communication equipment with an expression that made everyone in the immediate area pay attention. His radio had been monitoring government military frequencies, and the traffic he was hearing painted a picture that professional crisis managers didn't want to acknowledge. Government forces weren't just withdrawing from their area, they were conducting a general retreat that would leave large sections of the capital under the control of various factions. The government troops are pulling back to defensive positions around the airport and the presidential district, he announced, his voice carefully controlled but unable to hide his concern. That means everything between here and the city limits is going to be contested territory. The factions aren't just fighting the government. They're fighting each other for control of different neighborhoods and strategic positions. Alina Volkov absorbed this information with the rapid assessment skills that had made her valuable as a regional security advisor. Her understanding of local politics and factional dynamics allowed her to interpret the implications of military movements in ways that foreign personnel might miss. The picture that emerged from David's radio reports was significantly more complex and dangerous than a simple civil war between government and rebel forces. If multiple factions are operating independently, she said, thinking aloud as she processed the tactical situation, then negotiating safe passage becomes extremely complicated. We'd need agreements with several different groups, each with their own leadership, territorial claims, and political objectives. Some of them might be willing to protect international personnel, but others might see us as valuable assets to be captured rather than protected. Marcus Webb was receiving his own updates through secure channels that connected him to the broader security network operating throughout the region. His contacts included other private security firms, military contractors, and intelligence personnel who provided the kind of real-time information that official channels sometimes missed. The picture they painted was consistent with David's radio intercepts, but it included additional details that made their situation even more challenging. The road networks are being systematically blocked or destroyed, he reported after ending a brief, tense conversation with his regional coordinator. Factions are using roadblocks and improvised barriers to control movement and prevent government forces from repositioning. Even if we could negotiate safe passage with one group, we'd likely encounter other groups who weren't part of the agreement. Colonel Pierce consulted additional documentation that covered scenarios where normal evacuation procedures might not be applicable. The military's planning process included contingencies for situations where standard protocols failed. But those contingencies usually involved alternative, official resources that might not be available in their current circumstances. Her training emphasized working within established systems, but those systems were breaking down faster than alternatives could be arranged. Dr. Hayes made one final attempt to reach embassy personnel who might coordinate diplomatic solutions to their situation. His years of international crisis management had taught him that political problems usually required political solutions, and he maintained hope that appropriate officials might be available through channels that he hadn't yet exhausted. The phone rang several times before connecting to an automated message that informed him that embassy operations had been suspended indefinitely. Sarah continued making notes in her legal pad while the professionals around her worked through their official options and found each one increasingly unavailable. Their expertise was valuable and their concerns were legitimate, but their solutions depended on resources and authority that were no longer accessible. The institutional support that usually made their decision-making effective was absent when they needed it most. The fifth mortar round hit the compound's main gate, sending vibrations through the floor that everyone could feel in their bones. This time the lights went out completely for nearly 30 seconds before the emergency power engaged. When the red emergency lighting illuminated the operations center, Sarah noticed that conversations had stopped and everyone was looking around with the expression of people who were beginning to realize that their time for debate was running out. Marcus Webb's radio erupted with urgent chatter from his perimeter teams. The explosion at the main gate had been followed by small arms fire that suggested probing attacks rather than random artillery. His security personnel were reporting movement in multiple sectors around the compound, indicating that organized forces were beginning to test their defenses systematically. The compound's protection was shifting from passive security to active resistance against forces that were definitely interested in gaining access. Sarah closed her legal pad and stood up with the same quiet confidence she had shown throughout the crisis. Her worn hiking boots and faded canvas jacket looked completely inappropriate for the increasingly military atmosphere that was developing in the operations center. But her dark eyes held a calmness that seemed immune to the growing panic and uncertainty that was affecting even the most experienced professionals in the room. She walked to the central table where Marcus Webb was coordinating with his security teams. Dr. Hayes was attempting to re-establish diplomatic communications, and Colonel Pierce was consulting emergency protocols that seemed increasingly irrelevant to their situation. The radio chatter filled the air with urgent reports that painted a picture of approaching danger from multiple directions. Outside the reinforced windows, the explosions were definitely getting closer and more frequent. Sarah waited for a brief pause in the urgent conversations before speaking in the same quiet, measured tone she had used throughout the crisis. Her voice carried no urgency or dramatic emphasis, but it cut through the noise with the clarity of someone who had important information to share. "The perimeter teams are reporting organized probes," she said, looking directly at Marcus Webb. "That means the forces outside aren't just random fighters. They're conducting reconnaissance to identify weak points and defensive capabilities. They're planning a coordinated assault rather than opportunistic attacks." Marcus Webb looked up from his radio with the sharp attention of someone who had just heard tactical analysis that sounded professionally informed. Her assessment matched his own interpretation of the reports he was receiving, but it demonstrated a level of military understanding that he hadn't expected from a logistics coordinator. Sarah continued in the same calm voice, consulting her notes as if she were delivering a routine briefing. "Systematic probing usually precedes assault operations by approximately 2 to 4 hours, depending on the attacking force's capabilities and objectives. If they're taking time to assess our defenses properly, it means they have sufficient resources to overcome those defenses once they understand our limitations." Dr. Hayes paused in his communication attempts and turned towards Sarah with the expression of someone who was hearing analysis that sounded disturbingly accurate. Colonel Pierce looked up from her procedures manual and focused on the quiet woman who was providing tactical insights that weren't covered in her official documentation. The compound's defensive perimeter was designed to deter casual intrusion and provide security during normal operations, Sarah continued, her pencil moving across the yellow pages as she referred to calculations she had made earlier. It wasn't designed to withstand sustained assault by organized forces with military equipment. The walls will slow them down, but they won't stop them if they're willing to accept casualties to gain access. Elena Volkov was no longer consulting her intelligence reports about factional activities. David Torres had stopped monitoring radio chatter to listen to tactical analysis that seemed more immediately relevant than the distant communications he was intercepting. The operations center had grown quiet except for Sarah's measured voice and the distant sound of explosions that were definitely moving closer to their location. Based on the timing of the probing attacks and the systematic approach they're using, Sarah said, closing her legal pad and looking around the room at 100 people, who were finally beginning to understand that their secure compound might not remain secure much longer. We have approximately 3 hours before they begin their primary assault. After that, all evacuation options disappear permanently. The silence that followed her assessment was different from the earlier pauses in conversation. This wasn't the thoughtful quiet of people considering various options. It was the stunned silence of people who were beginning to understand that their time for choosing between alternatives was almost over. The institutional resources they had been counting on were unavailable. The official procedures they had been following were designed for situations that no longer matched their reality. And the quiet logistics coordinator with worn hiking boots and a yellow legal pad had just demonstrated that she understood their tactical situation better than the military and security professionals who were supposed to be managing their crisis. The same woman they had dismissed as too inexperienced for serious crisis management was now providing the most accurate assessment of their deteriorating situation. Marcus Webb set down his radio and looked at Sarah with the focused attention of someone who was trying to solve a puzzle that had suddenly become urgent. Dr. Hayes ended his communication attempts and turned toward the woman who had just provided analysis that his diplomatic training hadn't prepared him to evaluate. Colonel Pierce closed her procedures manual and gave Sarah the kind of professional attention that she usually reserved for military briefings. The compound shook with another explosion, closer than any of the previous ones, and the emergency lighting flickered ominously. Outside the reinforced windows, the sound of small arms fire was becoming more frequent and definitely more organized. 100 people stood in a secure facility that was rapidly becoming less secure while the clock ticked toward a deadline that none of them wanted to acknowledge. Sarah Chen tucked her pencil behind her ear and waited for their decision while her grandmother's silver watch marked time that was running out faster than anyone wanted to admit. The operations center fell into an uneasy quiet as the implications of Sarah's assessment settled over the assembled personnel. Marcus Webb found himself studying the logistics coordinator with new attention, trying to reconcile her unremarkable appearance with the tactical analysis she had just delivered. Her worn hiking boots and faded jacket suggested someone who spent time outdoors, but nothing in her 18 months at Meridian International had indicated military knowledge or crisis management experience beyond routine supply coordination. Dr. Hayes cleared his throat and addressed Sarah with the careful tone he used when navigating diplomatically sensitive territory. His years of international negotiations had taught him to probe carefully when encountering unexpected expertise, especially when that expertise might challenge established hierarchies or reveal uncomfortable truths about official capabilities. "Sarah, your assessment of our tactical situation sounds quite detailed," he said, his voice carrying both genuine curiosity and professional skepticism. "May I ask where you developed this kind of security analysis training? It's not typically part of logistics coordination responsibilities, and your personnel file doesn't mention military or security background." Sarah looked at Dr. Hayes with the same calm expression she maintained during routine staff meetings. But something in her dark eyes suggested depths that 18 months of casual interaction had never revealed. She consulted her legal pad briefly, then set it aside and folded her hands in front of her, with the patient composure of someone who had been asked this question before in other contexts. "I coordinate supply logistics for international aid operations," she said simply, her voice maintaining the same measured tone she had used throughout the crisis. Understanding operational security, terrain challenges, and threat assessment is necessary for ensuring that supplies reach their intended destinations safely and efficiently. Routes that look viable on paper sometimes prove problematic in field conditions. Colonel Pierce leaned forward with the expression of someone whose professional instincts were detecting information that deserved closer examination. Her military experience had taught her to recognize the subtle indicators that separated theoretical knowledge from practical expertise, and Sarah's analysis contained details that suggested direct familiarity with tactical situations rather than academic understanding. Supply route security and military threat assessment require different levels of training and experience, she said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had spent decades working with personnel databases and qualification requirements. Tactical analysis of defensive perimeters and assault timing typically requires formal military education or extensive field experience in combat operations. Sarah absorbed their questions without defensiveness or hesitation. The way she handled vendor inquiries about delivery schedules or contractor questions about maintenance specifications. Her 18 months at Meridian International had established her reputation as someone who answered questions directly and provided accurate information without unnecessary elaboration or self-promotion. Elena Volkov joined the informal interrogation with the expertise that had made her valuable as a regional security advisor. Her 3 years in Balkovia had included extensive interaction with military personnel, security contractors, and intelligence specialists, giving her familiarity with how different professionals approach tactical assessment and crisis management. "The kind of analysis you just provided requires understanding military planning principles and operational timing," she said, her accent giving weight to words chosen with careful precision. Predicting assault schedules based on reconnaissance patterns isn't something that most logistics coordinators would know, even those who work in challenging security environments. David Torres looked up from his communication equipment with the expression of someone who had been monitoring radio traffic that supported Sarah's tactical assessment. His sophisticated monitoring systems provided real-time intelligence about military movements and faction activities, and the information he was receiving aligned closely with the timeline and threat evaluation that Sarah had presented. "The radio chatter is definitely consistent with organized assault preparation," he confirmed, his voice tight with growing concern. "Multiple units are coordinating movements around the compound perimeter, and they're using military communication protocols rather than the improvised systems that irregular forces typically employ." Sarah's assessment about timing and organized capability appears to be accurate. Marcus Webb was receiving his own updates through secure channels that painted an increasingly urgent picture of their situation. His security network included contacts throughout the region who provided real-time intelligence about threat developments and military activities. The information he was gathering supported Sarah's analysis while raising additional questions about how a logistics coordinator could provide such accurate tactical predictions. "My sources are confirming organized movement by forces with military equipment and professional planning capabilities," he reported after ending a brief encrypted communication. "The probing attacks are definitely reconnaissance operations, and the forces conducting them have the resources to follow through with coordinated assault operations. The timeline Sarah suggested aligns with what my security contacts are observing." Sarah listened to their confirmations without satisfaction or vindication, making additional notes in her legal pad with the methodical attention she brought to all her work. The accuracy of her assessment was less important to her than the implications it carried for 100 people who were rapidly running out of time and options. The sixth mortar round hit the compound's administrative building, sending vibrations through the floor that caused ceiling tiles to rattle and dust to cascade from overhead fixtures. This explosion was followed immediately by the distinctive sound of small arms fire coming from multiple directions around the perimeter. The probing attacks that Sarah had described were escalating into active engagement between the compound security teams and approaching forces. Marcus Webb's radio erupted with urgent reports from his perimeter positions. His security personnel were taking sustained fire from organized teams that demonstrated tactical coordination and professional equipment. The random harassment that had characterized earlier attacks was giving way to systematic pressure designed to identify defensive capabilities and locate vulnerable positions. Alpha Team reports coordinated movement by at least 20 personnel with military-grade weapons. He announced, his voice maintaining professional calm despite the escalating situation. Bravo Team is engaging smaller groups that appear to be conducting reconnaissance in force. Charlie Team reports vehicle movement consistent with positioning for assault operations. Colonel Pierce opened her communications equipment and attempted to establish contact with military units that might provide support or coordination assistance. Her official channels connected her to regional command structures that were designed to maintain operational awareness and coordinate response to crisis situations. The responses she received painted a picture that aligned disturbingly well with Sarah's earlier predictions. Regional Command confirms that government forces are conducting strategic withdrawal to defensive positions around critical infrastructure, she reported after several tense minutes of encrypted communication. Military support for civilian evacuation. Operations has been suspended until tactical situation stabilizes. Estimated timeline for resumption of normal evacuation procedures is indefinite. Dr. Hayes made final attempts to reach diplomatic contacts who might arrange negotiated solutions to their deteriorating situation. His satellite phone connected him to automated systems and emergency messages that indicated systematic breakdown of normal diplomatic functions. The international organizations that usually coordinated crisis response were dealing with multiple, simultaneous emergencies that exceeded their available resources. Sarah stood quietly while the professionals around her exhausted their official options and confirmed that external rescue was unavailable within their operational timeline. Their expertise was valuable and their resources were sophisticated, but their solutions depended on institutional support that was absent when they needed it most. The careful procedures and established protocols that guided normal operations were designed for situations where governmental and military systems remained functional. Elena Volkov concluded her assessment of local political dynamics with obvious reluctance to acknowledge conclusions that eliminated most remaining alternatives. Her understanding of factional relationships and territorial disputes provided insight into why negotiated safe passage was unlikely to succeed, even if they could establish contact with appropriate faction leaders. The military situation has created opportunities for multiple groups to advance territorial claims and settle old disputes, she explained, her voice carrying the weight of someone who understood that political analysis sometimes led to uncomfortable conclusions. Factions that might normally respect international personnel are focused on immediate tactical advantages. Protecting foreign civilians isn't a priority when they're fighting for control of strategic positions. David Torres confirmed through his monitoring equipment that organized assault operations were definitely being prepared around their perimeter. The radio traffic he was intercepting included coordination between multiple teams, logistics support for sustained operations, and tactical communications that indicated professional military planning rather than improvised attacks by irregular forces. They're bringing up heavy equipment and additional personnel, he reported, his voice carefully controlled, but unable to hide his growing alarm. This isn't harassment or opportunistic attacks. They're planning a coordinated operation designed to overwhelm our defensive capabilities. Based on the traffic I'm monitoring, they have the resources to succeed. The seventh explosion shattered windows in the operations center's outer corridor and caused the main lighting to fail completely. Emergency power engaged immediately. But the red lighting that illuminated worried faces created an atmosphere that emphasized their isolation and vulnerability. 100 people gathered in a facility that was under active attack by forces with the capability and intention to gain access, regardless of resistance. Marcus Webb coordinated defensive responses through his radio network while acknowledging that his security teams were facing superior numbers and equipment. His perimeter positions were designed to deter casual intrusion rather than repel sustained military assault. The compound's defenses were adequate for normal security concerns, but insufficient for the organized attack that was developing around them. Defensive positions are holding for now, he announced, but ammunition supplies are limited and we're facing coordinated pressure from multiple directions. Enemy forces are using tactics and equipment that indicate professional military training. Our current defensive capabilities can delay them, but not prevent them from gaining access if they're willing to accept casualties. Sarah closed her legal pad and walked to the central table where maps of the local area were spread among communication equipment and tactical displays. Her movement drew attention from personnel who were beginning to recognize that her earlier assessment had been accurate while their own official resources were proving inadequate for their current situation. She studied the topographical maps with the same careful attention she brought to supply route planning, but her examination focused on terrain, features and elevation changes that weren't typically relevant to logistics coordination. Her finger traced potential movement corridors through mountain passes and river valleys that weren't marked on standard evacuation routes or security assessments. The organized assault will begin within 90 minutes, she said, her voice maintaining the same calm tone despite the increasingly desperate situation developing around them. The forces outside have completed their reconnaissance and positioned their equipment for coordinated attack. Once they begin, the compound's defensive perimeter will hold for approximately 45 minutes before being breached. Dr. Hayes absorbed this timeline with the growing realization that diplomatic solutions were no longer viable within their operational constraints. Colonel Pierce acknowledged that military evacuation procedures required resources and coordination that were unavailable in their current circumstances. Marcus Webb confirmed that his security capabilities were insufficient for prolonged defense against organized assault. Alina Volkov looked at the maps Sarah was examining and recognized terrain features that offered potential movement corridors through areas that might be less heavily controlled by the various factions competing for territorial advantage. David Torres confirmed through his monitoring equipment that the tactical situation was developing exactly as Sarah had predicted, with organized forces preparing for coordinated operations against their position. Sarah lifted her head from the maps and looked around the operations center at 100 people, who were finally understanding that their assumptions about rescue and protection were no longer valid. The institutional authority that usually provided guidance and security had exhausted its available options. Professional expertise that had managed previous crises was encountering a situation that exceeded the capabilities of normal response systems. The mountain pass option I described earlier remains viable, she said quietly, her dark eyes moving from Marcus Webb to Dr. Hayes to Colonel Pierce, with the patience of someone who had waited for them to understand their situation fully. The terrain is challenging and the weather conditions are marginal, but the route avoids areas where organized forces are likely to maintain control or establish checkpoints. Marcus Webb found himself looking at Sarah with the growing realization that her tactical knowledge exceeded what he had observed during 18 months of routine interaction. Her analysis of their situation had proven accurate while his own security Assessments had underestimated the capabilities and intentions of approaching forces. The quiet logistics coordinator was demonstrating expertise that he hadn't recognized or expected. "Sarah," he said, his voice carrying new respect mixed with professional curiosity, "your assessment of enemy capabilities and operational timing has been consistently accurate. That level of tactical understanding typically requires training and experience that goes beyond logistics coordination. What's your actual background in military or security operations?" Sarah met his gaze with the same calm expression she had maintained throughout the crisis, but something in her posture suggested that she was finally ready to provide information that she had kept private. During her time at Meridian International, her hands remained steady as she consulted her legal pad, but her voice carried subtle undertones that hadn't been present during routine staff interactions. "I served 8 years in the Army Reserve with specialized training in logistics operations. In hostile environments," she said simply, her words delivered with the same measured pace she used for routine reports. "My assignments included supply coordination for forward operating bases in Afghanistan, evacuation planning for civilian populations in conflict zones, and route security assessment for humanitarian operations in contested territories." The operations center fell completely silent except for the distant sound of gunfire and the steady chatter of radio communications. 100 people absorbed information that recontextualized 18 months of interaction with someone they had categorized as a civilian coordinator with limited relevant experience. The woman who had quietly managed their supply deliveries and maintenance schedules had been an Army Reserve officer with combat zone experience and specialized training in exactly the kind of situation they were currently facing. Colonel Pierce straightened with the involuntary respect that military personnel showed when encountering someone whose service record commanded professional acknowledgement. Her training emphasized the importance of proper recognition for military experience, especially when that experience was directly relevant to current operational requirements. "What was your rank and specialty classification?" she asked, her voice carrying the formal tone used for official military communication. Sarah's response was delivered with the precision that characterized all her communication, but her words carried the authority of someone whose military service had been both substantial and relevant to their current crisis. The quiet logistics coordinator was revealing a background that explained her tactical knowledge, while raising new questions about why she had concealed her qualifications during 18 months of civilian employment. "Captain, United States. Army Reserve, Military Occupation Specialty 90A. Logistics operations with additional qualifications in high-risk environment operations and foreign humanitarian assistance," she said, her voice maintaining the same calm tone while providing information that established her credentials for exactly the kind of operation she had been proposing. "My final assignment was logistics planning for civilian evacuation operations in contested territories of Afghanistan." Dr. Hayes absorbed this information with the diplomatic instincts that had guided his international career, recognizing that personnel qualifications sometimes remained hidden for reasons that weren't immediately apparent, but could be professionally or personally important. His experience with international organizations had taught him that many employees maintained privacy about military service or specialized training that might affect their assignments or relationships with colleagues. Marcus Webb was recalculating his assessment of their situation based on the realization that someone with appropriate qualifications had been available throughout the crisis, but hadn't been recognized or consulted because her military background wasn't reflected in her civilian personnel file. His security planning had assumed that no one in the compound possessed relevant expertise for the kind of operation they were now considering. Elena Volkov looked at Sarah with new understanding of why her tactical analysis had been so accurate, and why her proposed evacuation route demonstrated detailed knowledge of terrain and operational requirements. Regional security advisors worked regularly with military personnel, and she recognized the signs of someone whose expertise was based on direct experience rather than theoretical training. David Torres confirmed through his monitoring equipment that their timeline for decision-making was rapidly approaching its limit. The radio chatter he was intercepting indicated that assault operations were moving into final preparation phases, with coordinated teams positioning for synchronized attacks against multiple points around the compound perimeter. Sarah returned her attention to the topographical maps, tracing potential movement routes with the finger of someone who had planned similar operations under comparable circumstances. Her examination of terrain features and elevation changes reflected specialized training in route selection for movement through hostile territory by mixed groups of military and civilian personnel. The evacuation route through Thornfield Pass requires approximately 18 hours of movement through terrain that offers concealment from observation and natural defensive positions if we encounter hostile forces, she explained, her voice carrying the technical precision of someone briefing military operations. Weather conditions will be challenging but manageable with proper preparation and equipment. The route avoids populated areas where factions are likely to maintain control or establish checkpoints. Marcus Webb found himself looking at evacuation planning that reflected professional, military expertise rather than civilian logistics coordination. Sarah's assessment included factors that he hadn't considered and demonstrated knowledge of operational requirements that exceeded his own experience with security planning in civilian contexts. Colonel Pierce examined Sarah's route analysis with the recognition that specialized military training was being applied to their specific situation by someone with appropriate qualifications and direct experience. The evacuation planning reflected understanding of terrain analysis, threat assessment, and movement procedures that were consistent with formal military education and field experience. Dr. Hayes acknowledged that institutional resources he had been counting on were unavailable while alternative options were being presented by someone whose qualifications had been unknown but were now clearly relevant to their crisis. His diplomatic training included recognition that emergency situations sometimes required non-standard solutions, implemented by personnel with specialized capabilities. The eighth explosion hit close enough to shake dust from the ceiling and cause several people to duck reflexively. This time the gunfire that followed was sustained and organized, indicating that systematic assault operations were beginning rather than continuing reconnaissance activities. The timeline that Sarah had provided was proving accurate while their window for decision-making continued to narrow. Sarah closed her legal pad and looked around the operations center at 100 people who were finally understanding that their assumptions about rescue, protection, and leadership might need to be reconsidered based on changed circumstances and newly revealed information. The quiet logistics coordinator who had managed their routine operations for 18 months was an Army Reserve captain with specialized training in exactly the kind of operation they desperately needed. Marcus Webb, Dr. Hayes, Colonel Pierce, Elena Volkov, and David Torres found themselves looking at someone whose military qualifications exceeded their own, while her proposed solution offered the only viable alternative to remaining in a compound that was under organized assault by forces with superior numbers and equipment. The institutional authority that usually guided their decision-making had exhausted its available options. Professional procedures that had managed previous crises were inadequate for their current situation. External resources that they had counted on were unavailable when they needed them most. And the woman they had dismissed as too inexperienced for crisis management was now the most qualified person in the room to lead 100 civilians through 200 miles of enemy territory to safety. The same person who had quietly coordinated their supply deliveries and maintenance schedules was an Army Reserve officer with combat zone experience and specialized training in humanitarian evacuation operations. Sarah Chen stood, quietly while her grandmother's silver watch ticked toward a deadline that would eliminate all remaining alternatives, waiting for their decision about whether to trust their lives to someone whose qualifications they had finally discovered, but whose capabilities they were still struggling to accept. The mountain wind cut through the darkness like broken glass as Sarah Chen led 100 souls into the wilderness of Balkovia. Behind them, the Meridian International compound burned orange against the night sky, its defensive perimeter finally breached after 43 minutes of sustained assault. The explosions that had marked their final moments in the operations center now faded into distant thunder, replaced by the crunch of boots on frozen ground and the labored breathing of people who had never imagined they would be fleeing for their lives through enemy territory. Sarah moved at the front of the column with the fluid confidence of someone who had navigated hostile terrain before, but her companion saw only the same worn hiking boots and faded canvas jacket that had marked her as unremarkable during 18 months of routine interaction. Her legal pad was now tucked inside a waterproof case, along with topographical maps that she had memorized years earlier during specialized training that none of them had known she possessed. The yellow pencil that had seemed so mundane in the operations center was now clipped to her jacket as an essential navigation tool for a journey that would determine whether they lived or died. The evacuation had begun with chaos that nearly destroyed their chances before they started. When Sarah's timeline proved accurate and assault forces breached the compound's outer defenses, 100 terrified people had 30 minutes to gather essential supplies and form a movement column. Marcus Webb's security team provided covering fire while civilians stuffed backpacks with whatever they could carry. Dr. Hayes coordinated the destruction of sensitive documents and communication equipment. Colonel Pierce supervised the distribution of emergency supplies according to procedures that had seemed abstract until they became matters of survival. Elena Volkov had argued until the final moments that negotiated surrender might be safer than attempting to move through hostile territory in winter conditions. David Torres had maintained radio contact with approaching forces until the last possible second, hoping for some alternative that would avoid the desperate gamble of trusting their lives to mountain passes and frozen rivers. But when enemy forces reached the compound's inner perimeter, diplomatic solutions and communication alternatives disappeared along with the illusion that institutional authority could protect them from the chaos engulfing Balkovia. Sarah had supervised the evacuation with the calm efficiency that had characterized her work in Afghanistan, but her instructions carried new weight when delivered in circumstances where mistakes would be measured in lives rather than delayed. Supply deliveries. She organized the column by physical capability and medical conditions, placed stronger hikers at intervals to assist those who might struggle, and established communication procedures that would maintain group cohesion without requiring radio equipment that could be intercepted by hostile forces. The first night had tested everyone's assumptions about their own limitations and capabilities. The temperature dropped to -15 degrees Celsius as they climbed into the Thornfield Mountains, following paths that existed only in Sarah's memory and on maps that showed terrain features invisible in the darkness. Aid workers who spent their days in heated offices found themselves crossing frozen streams and navigating rocky slopes that seemed impossible to traverse safely. Diplomatic personnel accustomed to official vehicles and secure transportation struggled with backpacks and hiking boots while climbing elevations that left them breathless and exhausted. Marcus Webb had initially attempted to maintain security protocols designed for civilian evacuation operations, but mountain warfare required different approaches that challenged his training and experience. Sarah's instructions about movement, discipline, and noise control reflected specialized knowledge that exceeded his own expertise in terrain that he had never encountered during his military service. The security procedures that had served him well in urban environments were inadequate for leading mixed groups through wilderness areas, where enemy forces might be positioned anywhere along their route. Dr. Hayes discovered that diplomatic skills provided limited value when dealing with exhaustion, altitude effects, and the psychological stress of fleeing through territory controlled by hostile forces. His experience with international negotiations hadn't prepared him for the leadership challenges that emerged when 60-year-old administrative staff struggled to maintain the pace required for reaching concealed positions before dawn. The interpersonal dynamics that he managed so effectively in conference rooms became life-threatening obstacles when applied to people whose physical and emotional resources were being pushed beyond their normal limits. Colonel Pierce found that military procedures designed for trained personnel required modification when applied to civilians who had never operated under field conditions. Her leadership training emphasized discipline and order, but maintaining movement schedules with people who lacked military fitness and wilderness experience required flexibility that challenged her institutional approach to problem-solving. The standard operating procedures that provided structure in military environments needed constant adaptation for groups that included elderly diplomats, injured aid workers, and support staff whose physical capabilities varied dramatically. Sarah guided them through techniques that seemed impossible until they worked. When the group struggled with steep climbing sections, she showed them how to use trekking poles improvised from walking sticks and how to maintain footing on icy surfaces using techniques that required balance rather than strength. When altitude affected older members of the group, she adjusted their pace and implemented rest schedules that maintained progress while preventing medical emergencies that could compromise the entire evacuation. The second day brought their first encounter with hostile forces that nearly ended their journey before they reached the halfway point. Sarah had positioned the group in a concealed ravine during daylight hours to avoid detection by enemy patrols, but a faction checkpoint had been established overnight along their planned route through the Volga River Valley. 12 armed fighters controlled the bridge that represented their only viable crossing point for 50 kilometers in either direction. Marcus Webb had advocated for attempting to bypass the checkpoint by backtracking to alternative crossing points that would add 2 days to their journey through territory where other faction groups might have established similar obstacles. Dr. Hayes had suggested attempting to negotiate safe passage by identifying the faction's political leadership and offering humanitarian considerations that might motivate them to allow unarmed civilians to pass without interference. Colonel Pierce had recommended establishing observation positions to assess the enemy's capabilities and develop tactical alternatives that might allow them to cross the river without direct confrontation. Sarah had listened to their suggestions with the patience that characterized all her decision-making, but her assessment of their situation reflected military training that prioritized achievable objectives over optimal solutions. Their food supplies were calculated for a specific timeline that didn't include detours or delays. Their physical condition was deteriorating with each day of wilderness travel that exceeded the normal fitness levels of their mixed group. Weather forecasts indicated approaching storm systems that would make mountain travel impossible if they didn't reach lower elevations within 36 hours. The river crossing that changed everything began at 3 in the morning when Sarah led a reconnaissance team that included Marcus Webb and 3 volunteers to assess the checkpoint security procedures. They observed the position for 2 hours, noting guard rotations, equipment positions, and patrol patterns that revealed operational weaknesses typical of hastily established tactical positions. The faction fighters were competent but not professional soldiers, and their checkpoint procedures reflected local knowledge rather than military training. Sarah's plan reflected her specialized experience in operations that required civilian populations to move through contested areas without engaging hostile forces directly. Instead of attempting to fight through the checkpoint or negotiate passage that might be refused, she proposed creating a diversion that would draw the guards away from their position long enough for the entire group to cross the bridge and disappear into terrain that offered concealment from pursuit. The diversion consisted of a carefully controlled explosion, created from maintenance supplies that Marcus Webb's team had salvaged from the compound. The blast occurred 800 meters upstream from the checkpoint, simulating the kind of artillery impact that would require immediate investigation by forces responsible for controlling that area of terrain. When the explosion echoed through the valley, all 12 guards abandoned their positions to investigate the apparent threat, leaving the bridge undefended for exactly 17 minutes. Sarah led 100 people across the Volga River. In quote, Sarah led 100 people across the Volga River. 14 minutes, moving in small groups that minimized noise and maintained intervals that would prevent the entire column from being compromised if they encountered unexpected resistance. The crossing proceeded with the precision of a military operation executed by civilians who had learned to follow instructions without debate or hesitation. By the time the faction fighters returned to their checkpoint, the bridge showed no evidence that anyone had passed through their area during the night. The psychological transformation that occurred during the river crossing marked the moment when 100 frightened civilians became a cohesive unit capable of extraordinary achievement. Under impossible circumstances, aid workers who had struggled with basic hiking techniques were now moving through hostile territory with the confidence of people who understood that their survival depended on trusting Sarah's leadership completely. Diplomatic personnel who had questioned every tactical decision were now following instructions without argument because they had witnessed the consequences of military expertise applied to their specific situation. Marcus Webb acknowledged that his security training hadn't prepared him for the specialized requirements of leading mixed civilian groups through extended wilderness operations in hostile territory. Sarah's background included exactly this type of operation, and her decisions reflected experience that exceeded his own expertise in terrain and circumstances that challenged conventional security approaches. He began deferring to her tactical judgment while focusing his own efforts on tasks that utilized his training more effectively. Dr. Hayes recognized that successful evacuation operations required leadership skills that differed significantly from diplomatic management techniques. Sarah's approach emphasized practical solutions that addressed immediate survival requirements rather than optimal outcomes that might not be achievable under their constraints. Her decision-making process prioritized group cohesion and mission completion over individual preferences or institutional procedures that had become irrelevant to their situation. Colonel Pierce observed that Sarah's leadership style reflected military training that had been adapted for civilian populations operating under emergency conditions. Her instructions were clear and specific without being intimidating to people who lacked military experience. Her authority derived from demonstrated competence rather than institutional rank, and her decisions reflected understanding of how psychological and physical stress affected group performance over extended periods. The third day brought weather conditions that tested the group's physical and emotional resilience while validating Sarah's route selection and timing calculations. A winter storm system moved through the Thornfield Mountains with winds exceeding 60 kilometers per hour and snowfall that reduced visibility to less than 50 meters. The temperature dropped to minus 22 degrees Celsius while they were crossing exposed ridgelines that offered no natural shelter from the wind. Sarah had anticipated the storm system and positioned the group in a series of natural caves that provided protection from the weather while maintaining concealment from enemy forces that might be operating in the area. The cave system had been used during previous conflicts by local resistance fighters, and Sarah's knowledge of its location reflected specialized intelligence that wasn't available through normal sources. Her preparation included emergency supplies and heating materials that allowed the group to maintain body temperature and morale during 36 hours of severe weather. Elena Volkov had initially questioned Sarah's decision to enter the cave system because her regional intelligence indicated that several faction groups used mountain caves for weapon storage and training facilities. The risk of encountering hostile forces in confined spaces seemed greater than the benefits of weather protection, especially when alternative shelter options might be available at lower elevations. Her concerns were based on accurate intelligence, but they didn't account for Sarah's detailed knowledge of specific cave systems and their historical usage patterns. David Torres had maintained minimal radio monitoring throughout their journey, listening for communications that might indicate enemy movements or search operations directed at their group. During the storm, his equipment detected radio traffic suggesting that faction forces were conducting systematic sweeps through the Thornfield Mountains, apparently searching for the missing personnel from the Meridian International Compound. The hostile forces were using the same weather conditions that protected the group to mask their own movements while searching areas where evacuees might seek shelter. Sarah's choice of concealment proved crucial when enemy search teams passed within 200 meters of their position during the height of the storm. The natural cave system provided acoustic isolation that prevented their voices from being detected, while offering multiple exit routes that would allow them to escape if their position was discovered. The faction fighters conducting the search were equipped for winter operations, but they were following predictable patterns that reflected standard search procedures rather than specialized knowledge of terrain features that offered superior concealment. The psychological pressure of hiding in darkness while armed enemies searched nearby tested the group's discipline and trust in Sarah's leadership. Civilians who had never experienced combat conditions found themselves lying motionless for hours, while listening to voices speaking foreign languages just outside their shelter. The experience required emotional control that exceeded their normal stress management capabilities, but they maintained silence because they understood that any noise could compromise the entire group's survival. Sarah remained calm throughout the ordeal, monitoring the search operation through careful observation, while making contingency plans that would allow them to escape if their concealment failed. Her behavior demonstrated the kind of leadership that emerges during extreme situations when theoretical training becomes practical survival skills. The group's confidence in her decisions increased as they observed how her specialized knowledge repeatedly provided solutions to challenges that seemed insurmountable to people without military experience. The storm ended on the fourth morning, revealing landscape that had been transformed by heavy snowfall and strong winds. The mountain passes that Sarah had planned to use were partially blocked by snowdrifts, but alternative routes remained viable for people willing to accept slower progress and increased physical demands. The weather had eliminated tracks from their previous movement while creating new obstacles that required modified techniques for safe traverse. The descent toward Sanctuary Base began under clear skies that offered unlimited visibility, but also exposed them to observation by enemy forces that might be positioned anywhere along their route. Sarah modified their movement procedures to take advantage of terrain features that provided concealment while maintaining progress toward their objective. The group's improved physical conditioning and psychological resilience allowed them to maintain the pace required for reaching friendly territory before their food supplies were exhausted. Marcus Webb coordinated rear security that protected the group from potential pursuit while learning wilderness movement techniques that exceeded his previous training. His military experience provided valuable skills for perimeter security and threat assessment, but mountain warfare required specialized knowledge that Sarah possessed through her service in Afghanistan's challenging terrain. Their combined expertise created security capabilities that neither could have provided individually. Dr. Hayes managed the group's morale and interpersonal dynamics using diplomatic skills that proved valuable for maintaining cohesion during extended stress. His experience with international personalities helped him identify potential conflicts before they affected group performance, while Sarah's military leadership provided the authority structure necessary for making decisions quickly when circumstances didn't allow extended discussion or consensus building. Colonel Pierce supervised supply management and medical care using military logistics training that complemented Sarah's specialized knowledge of wilderness operations. Her organizational skills ensured that essential resources were distributed efficiently while maintaining reserves for emergency situations. The combination of military and civilian expertise created capabilities that allowed the group to function effectively despite equipment limitations and challenging environmental conditions. Elena Volkov provided intelligence about local conditions and potential threats using her regional expertise to interpret signs of factional activity that might affect their route selection. Her knowledge of political dynamics helped them avoid areas where territorial disputes might create additional hazards for international personnel attempting to reach friendly forces. Her linguistic skills proved valuable for understanding overheard conversations that provided information about enemy operations. David Torres maintained communications discipline while monitoring for radio traffic that might indicate threats or opportunities for establishing contact with friendly forces. His technical expertise allowed him to detect enemy communications without revealing their own position, providing early warning about potential encounters with hostile forces. His equipment also allowed them to confirm that Sanctuary Base remained operational and was expecting evacuees from their area. The fifth day brought them within visual range of Sanctuary Base, but it also revealed the final obstacle that would determine whether their journey ended in success or tragedy. Enemy forces had established a checkpoint system around the base perimeter that required systematic identification of all personnel attempting to enter the secure area. The checkpoint procedures were designed to prevent infiltration by hostile forces, but they also created potential exposure for evacuees who might be detained or questioned about their activities during the evacuation period. Sarah assessed the checkpoint situation with the analytical skills that had guided her decisions throughout their journey. The enemy forces controlling the approaches to Sanctuary Base were different from the faction fighters they had encountered previously. These were organized military units with professional equipment and procedures that reflected formal training rather than improvised operations. Their capabilities exceeded those of the groups that had been searching for evacuees in the mountain areas. The final approach required timing and coordination that utilized every skill the group had developed during their journey through hostile territory. Sarah's plan involved approaching the base perimeter during a shift change that would create brief confusion in the checkpoint procedures. The approach would be conducted in small groups that could be explained as separate evacuation attempts rather than a coordinated operation that might raise questions about leadership and organization. Marcus Webb led the advance team that established contact with friendly forces while confirming that the advance team that established contact with friendly forces while confirming that the checkpoint procedures would allow their group to enter the secure area safely. His military credentials and security background provided credibility with base personnel who were suspicious of evacuees claiming to come from compromised facilities. His communication with base security also confirmed that the Meridian International compound had been completely overrun and that no other evacuation attempts had been successful. Dr. Hayes coordinated with base administration to ensure that their group would receive appropriate processing and assistance without extended interrogation that might reveal information about their route or methods. His diplomatic status provided access to officials who could authorize expedited processing for international personnel, whose presence at the base served humanitarian rather than military purposes. His negotiations also ensured that medical care would be available for group members who had been injured or exhausted during their journey. Colonel Pierce managed the logistics of moving 100 people through checkpoint procedures that were designed for individual processing rather than group operations. Her military experience allowed her to understand the security requirements that governed base access while negotiating modifications that accommodated their unusual circumstances. Her coordination ensured that essential supplies and equipment were transferred to base custody without creating security concerns for military personnel. The moment when 100 exhausted civilians walked through the gates of Sanctuary Base marked the completion of a journey that military experts had considered impossible under the circumstances they faced. Every person who had left the Meridian International Compound 5 days earlier was accounted for and alive. No one had been captured by enemy forces or lost to environmental hazards during their movement through 200 kilometers of hostile territory in winter conditions. Sarah Chen stood quietly while base personnel conducted administrative processing that would document their successful evacuation and provide official recognition for an operation that had saved 100 lives through leadership that challenged conventional assumptions about military expertise and institutional authority. Her worn hiking boots and faded canvas jacket looked completely out of place among the uniforms and equipment that surrounded them, but her calm demeanor reflected the satisfaction of someone who had completed a mission successfully despite overwhelming obstacles. The base commander, Colonel Maria Santos, interviewed Sarah privately about the evacuation operation while processing reports that documented an achievement that exceeded the expectations of military planners who had written off the Meridian International Compound as a total loss. Her questions revealed professional respect for tactical decisions that had succeeded where conventional approaches would have failed, and her assessment recognized specialized expertise that deserved formal acknowledgement. "Captain Chun, Colonel," Santos said, using the military rank that Sarah's service record supported, but that she had never mentioned during 18 months of civilian employment. "Your evacuation operation represents exactly the kind of leadership that our military personnel should study and emulate. You saved 100 lives using techniques that demonstrate mastery of skills that we struggle to teach in our advanced training programs." Sarah accepted the recognition with the same quiet professionalism that had characterized her military service and civilian career. Her response reflected understanding that successful operations were measured by results rather than recognition, and her primary satisfaction came from knowing that her specialized training had been used effectively when it was needed most. The group's survival was the result of their willingness to trust instructions and follow procedures that were outside their normal experience, she replied, her voice maintaining the same measured tone that had guided 100 people through impossible circumstances. Military training provides useful tools, but civilian personnel can achieve extraordinary results when they're properly led and motivated. The debriefing sessions that followed documented techniques and procedures that would become part of advanced training curricula for military personnel who might face similar evacuation requirements in future operations. Sarah's route selection, movement procedures, and leadership methods were analyzed by specialists who recognized innovations that exceeded existing doctrinal approaches to civilian evacuation operations in hostile territory. Marcus Webb provided security assessments that emphasized the importance of recognizing military expertise that might not be immediately apparent in civilian personnel records. His recommendations included procedures for identifying and utilizing specialized training that could prove crucial during emergency operations when conventional resources were unavailable or inadequate for mission requirements. Dr. Hayes submitted diplomatic reports that documented the breakdown of institutional support systems during crisis situations and the importance of adaptive leadership that could function effectively when normal authority structures were compromised. His analysis emphasized the value of personnel who could bridge military and civilian approaches to problem solving under extreme circumstances. Colonel Pierce contributed military assessments that highlighted the effectiveness of combining formal training with practical experience in operations that required innovative solutions to challenges that weren't covered by standard procedures. Her documentation provided evidence that specialized expertise could emerge from unexpected sources when properly identified and utilized. Elena Volkov prepared intelligence reports that analyzed the political and military dynamics that had made their evacuation necessary, while documenting the tactical innovations that had allowed them to succeed despite overwhelming obstacles. Her assessment provided context for understanding how regional conflicts could create situations that required unconventional solutions implemented by personnel with diverse backgrounds and capabilities. David Torres documented the communication and technical aspects of their operation while providing recommendations for equipment and procedures that could improve future evacuation operations in similar circumstances. His technical analysis emphasized the importance of maintaining operational security while utilizing available resources effectively under challenging conditions. The broader impact of their successful evacuation extended beyond the immediate rescue of 100 people from a dangerous situation. Military planners throughout the region began studying Sarah's techniques and procedures as examples of innovative leadership that achieved results when conventional approaches failed. Training programs were modified to include scenarios that emphasized adaptive thinking and unconventional resource utilization. International organizations responsible for humanitarian operations in conflict zones incorporated lessons learned from the Meridian International Evacuation into their emergency procedures and leadership development programs. The operation demonstrated that civilian personnel could possess military expertise that might prove crucial during crisis situations, and personnel management systems were revised to identify and document specialized training that might not be immediately apparent from civilian job descriptions. Sarah returned to humanitarian work with different responsibilities that utilized her demonstrated expertise in crisis management and evacuation operations. Her new position involved training civilian personnel in survival techniques and evacuation procedures that could save lives when institutional support systems failed or became unavailable during emergency situations. The 100 people whose lives she had saved through 200 kilometers of hostile territory carried forward lessons about leadership, courage, and the extraordinary capabilities that could emerge from ordinary individuals when circumstances demanded excellence. Their experience demonstrated that true expertise often remained hidden until situations arose that required its application for purposes more important than career advancement or institutional recognition. Years later, when international crises created similar challenges for humanitarian organizations operating in dangerous territories, the techniques and procedures developed during the Meridian International Evacuation provided proven methods for protecting civilian personnel when conventional resources were unavailable. Sarah's leadership had created a legacy that extended far beyond the specific circumstances of their journey through the mountains of Balkovia. The quiet logistics coordinator who had managed supply deliveries and maintenance schedules for 18 months had revealed herself to be a military officer whose specialized training saved 100 lives when institutional authority failed and conventional procedures proved inadequate. Her story became a reminder that expertise and leadership could emerge from unexpected sources when circumstances required individuals to reveal capabilities that they had kept private or unused. Sarah Chen never sought recognition for her military service or the successful evacuation that had made her a legend among military personnel who studied unconventional operations. She continued her humanitarian work with the same quiet professionalism that had characterized her civilian career, knowing that specialized training was most valuable when applied to purposes larger than personal achievement or professional advancement. The mountains of Balkovia remained dangerous territory controlled by various factions, competing for political and territorial advantage, but the route that Sarah had led 100 civilians through to safety was remembered by military planners as proof that impossible missions could be accomplished by leaders who possessed the right combination of expertise, determination, and commitment to protecting the lives entrusted to their care. Her grandmother's silver watch continued to tick quietly against her wrist as she moved through her daily responsibilities, marking time that was measured not in recognition or reward, but in lives protected and missions accomplished when conventional. Solutions failed, and extraordinary leadership became the difference between survival and tragedy. The woman they had abandoned to lead others to safety had proven that true strength emerged not from institutional authority, but from the willingness to accept responsibility when others could not or would not act to protect those who depended on their decisions. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.